Good morning, everyone. Let's see. Looks like everyone can hear me. That's good. So let's share the screen. So today we're going to talk about the material from chapter 8. So this is the nature of mind, not the mind, but mind itself. And this is one of my favorite topics. So I'm really excited to get into the materials for today. Oh, right here. So, without further ado, I suppose we're getting back to some of the less really abstract material. Like the last 2 weeks, I think I mentioned this before, but the last 2 weeks, that material was probably as abstract as it gets in this class. Talking about universals and particulars and so forth. This should be a little bit more straightforward. And I've got a couple of fun thought experiments lined up for today as well. So let's start with reflecting on the sorts of states and events that make up one's mental life, right? Um, your mental life includes all kinds of things like beliefs and desires, the emotions, obviously, pains, pleasures, memories, um, all kinds of things. And I think humans have a tendency to um, think of mental things differently than they do physical things, right? There's something different, um, or there seems to be something different when it comes to mental objects and physical objects. And we'll unpack that difference as we proceed through today's lecture. One important thing which I didn't want to leave out here was the content of the first box in this chapter. A lot of times I skip over those boxes, but not this one. An important thing to know that is that mental states, like beliefs and desires, these aren't just representations, mental representations of the world. At least that's not the only way to understand them. Philosophers often talk about mental states like beliefs and desires in terms of what we call propositional attitudes. So these are literally attitudes that we adopt towards propositions. And propositions are statements about the world. They're statements about the world that can have a truth value, right? So the example that I always go with is it is raining, right? That's a proposition. It can be true or false. Right now, if I were to utter the sentence, it is presently raining in Sandy Hill, that would be false. It is actually not raining presently in Sandy Hill. Sometimes we call these that clauses because they form the content of our mental states, our attitudes towards these propositions. The propositions are what our mental states, like beliefs and desires, are about. So if I have the belief that it is not currently raining in Sandy Hill, I believe that it is not currently raining. I have a belief or an attitude towards the proposition, it is raining. Here in the slides, I've put, is it snowing? Because we're getting toward that time of year, right? So I believe that, it is raining or it is snowing, or I do not believe, or I believe that it is not raining or it is not snowing. The proposition, the sentence about the world, forms the content of my mental state. And that's going to be important as we move through this chapter. So I just didn't want to leave that out. But recall, right? We tend to think of our of mental objects like memories, emotions, propositional attitudes, so forth, are different than physical things. Why does it seem this way? Well, again, we'll unpack this a little bit as we go. Um, but what do you all think? Does there seem to be a difference between the objects that we find in the world and the objects that uh, we find in minds? I'll kick this question over to everyone else. Um, Feel free to speak up in the chat if you like. But what are some things that, or what are some characteristics that make um, mental objects seem so different from physical objects? Mm, well, we can kind of perceive mental objects, right? We can introspect. Um, if I'm feeling an emotion, for example, that could be kind of like perception. Um, yeah, objects in the mind have a sort of subjectivity to them, I suppose, is what you're saying, Nicholas. Yeah, we can't touch them. Yeah, they're abstract and untouchable. They don't have physical substance. There we go. We're getting there. Um, yeah. What I'm trying to get at is that remember obvious parts, yeah, physical thing. Yeah. This is where we're going with this, is that if there are objects out there in the world, um, those are physical objects. We're pretty used to thinking of those as physical objects, right? Um, Mental objects seem kind of non-physical, right? Um, yeah, Ryan, that's true. That's a mental representation, right? So that's another important point. Um, so mental items, like, there doesn't seem to be anything physical about my about my memories, about my beliefs and desires, about my pains and pleasures, right? Um, Maybe there's a bit of a blurred line when it comes to certain sensations, though, like um, it feels good to get one's prep work done or one's homework done. But that feels good, perhaps in a less physical way or a less noticeably physical way than, say, getting I don't know, like a really good massage, right? Emotions also have a physical component to them, right? Because we feel them in our bodies, right? But beliefs and desires, perceptual objects, they don't seem physical, right? Like there's this coffee cup in the world, but there's also, my mental representation of the coffee cup. And that seems like kind of non-physical. So is that the way that it really is, right? There are theories of the mental, like dualism, which say that the mental and the physical are different kinds of things, completely different kinds of things. And in one important sense or another, mental items or mental objects are non-physical. But not everyone agrees with that. If you are a physicalist, you believe in physicalism, what you say is that everything is ultimately physical. What does that mean? It means Really, in this context, the kinds of things we find in the natural world, um, matter and energy, that kind of thing. So, physicalism used to be called materialism. Sometimes it still is, but I prefer the term physicalism. Materialism doesn't mean obsessed with acquiring wealth or possessions, right? In this context, materialism is the sort of enlightenment view of the universe. Everything is matter in motion. There's nothing else that exists, right? Of course, now we know that there's more out there in the world than just matter. There are non-material things like force fields, for example. So, like gravitational fields, electromagnetic fields, and so forth, right? Um, these aren't really material, but they're still physical. So, a physicalist would say there's just matter and energy. So, the mind must be matter and energy. The mind must be physical. um, Mental things must be um, either reducible to the physical or um, maybe if you're a functionalist, um, it's more about how things are organized, right? It's not the material that the mind is made of, it's how it's put together and what it does. But you emphasize the physicality of mental objects. A physicalist would deny, for example, that ghosts exist, right? Because ghosts would be sort of supernatural, non-physical entities, one would think, right? I noticed that there are a couple of sets of characteristics that define the physical for us. Um, one one set is delivered via the senses, so we can know about the shape of objects, maybe how they're behaving, like their motion. We can know about their colors and their perhaps smells and sounds and so forth, right, via the senses. So that's one way, one set of characteristics that our senses deliver to us. And empirical science delivers another set, things like mass, the spin or charge or flavor of some atomic particles. These things mean something different, by the way, um, in physics than they do in everyday life, right? We talk of quarks, for example, having flavors. That doesn't mean that quarks actually have a taste, right? It means something else entirely, which, if you're taking a physics class, you'll have to ask your physics professor about. Um, Now, physicalism is a type of substance monism. Substance monism says that only one kind of thing, only one kind of substance exists. So, think back to our discussion about um, what substance is from the last, oh, excuse me, from the last week or so. If you're a physicalist, your substances are matter, energy, things like that. That is the substance that makes everything up, including minds. But, right, to get back to kind of where we started, it does seem like your mental life um, is made up of things which are very, very different from physical objects. Mental objects seem quite different. Just to highlight this difference, think of how vision works. And this is a very, very rough sketch of how vision works, but if you've got um, light of certain wavelengths being reflected off the surfaces of objects, physical objects, those go through my pupil and hit my retina, and they're transduced by the retina into neural signals. and those neural signals go down the optic nerves and into the optic tract. Eventually, they reach my visual cortex, which, by the way, is toward the back of the brain in the occipital lobes. And it causes activity in those neurons there. And before you know it, I get a perception of this coffee cup. I mean, I've drastically oversimplified this, right? But the physical processes of vision are, pretty well understood. But what I get at the end of that process, this experience of this coffee cup, this mental representation of the coffee cup, seems like an altogether different kind of thing than the coffee cup itself, right? The coffee cup is an object out there in the world made of matter, and it's got certain properties like cylindricality and solidity and volume, right? But my mental representation of the coffee cup, I mean, that seems to be in here. In some sense, it seems to be non-physical. So is there more to the mind than just what is physical? Maybe. If you were a dualist, you would say, yes, there is more to the mind than just the physical. Where physicalism is a kind of substance monism, only one kind of substance exists, there is also substance dualism. Two kinds of substances exist, mind and matter. But there's another kind of dualism that we're going to learn about today called property dualism. And it says that there's one kind of substance, the physical. But sometimes when this substance is, arranged in the right way, for example, if we get atoms and molecules arranged in the appropriate arrangements or with the appropriate functions, we get something very special. We get mental properties. So if you're a dualist, one way or another, whether you're a property dualist or a substance dualist, you believe that the mental is non-physical. You could describe, if we had perfect knowledge of the physical, right? If we could describe every physical fact about the natural world, about the universe, we would still be leaving something out. Our physical descriptions would be incomplete because they would leave out the mental. And what is motivating this claim? What's motivating dualism here? Well, the mental has two important characteristics for our purposes here, which Crumley mentions in this chapter. Mental states have content. So mental states are about things. We call this intentionality, this sort of aboutness, right? My perception of the coffee cup is about the coffee cup, right? If I have a belief that it is raining, my belief is about either the proposition it is raining or what is going on out there in the world. So that aboutness is called intentionality. And some people say that intentionality is the mark of the mental. That's actually called Brentano's thesis after philosopher Franz Brentano. So that's one important characteristic of the mental, intentionality. Another is that mental states have feeling, right? There's something that it's like to be in pain. There's something that it's like to stub your toe, right? Or get a paper cut. It's unpleasant, right? There's something that it's like to feel satisfied after a yummy meal. There's something that it's like to view a beautiful sunset. There's something that it's like to taste coffee, right? These felt qualities of experience are called qualia or singular quale. So the aroma of this coffee is a quale, right? The blueness of this shirt is a quale. Plural, we call all of these felt qualities qualia. And we also call this what it's like aspect of our experience phenomenology, which, recall, comes from appearance. So what it's like, what it appears to us, or how it appears to us, phenomenology, right? There's something that it's like to taste this coffee, which is different from what it's like to taste green tea, which is different from what it's like to taste a pumpkin spice latte, so on and so on and so on. You get the idea, I think. Now, dualists argue that we need to look beyond the physical to explain things like intentionality and phenomenology. We cannot explain this sort of what its likeness of our experience by appealing to the physical. Think about it. Coffee tastes the way it does because of the molecules it's made out of, right? So I have some light roast coffee here with some cream, and that's it. And so, what I taste depends on the molecules that are hitting my taste buds and going into my olfactory sensors, right? That determines how the coffee tastes and smells. But there's nothing intrinsically, coffee-like about those molecules. In other words, it's not like the taste of the coffee is out there in the molecules. It's in my mind, right? It's a mental representation. So again, it seems non-physical. Likewise with intentionality. Coffee cups aren't about things. Mental representations of coffee cups are. Namely, they're about coffee cups. Their content is coffee cups, right? So that's why dualists would say that we've got to look beyond the physical. So here's an interesting thought experiment to try and get us started in thinking about how physicalism and dualism differ. This is called Mary's Room. From a paper Frank Jackson wrote called What Mary Didn't Know. And it's interesting, Jackson has actually changed his mind about what this thought experiment means. But it is a fun thought experiment. Here, I'll just get myself out of the way. So here's Frank Jackson here. He's an Australian philosopher, still philosophizing. I just, this black and white picture is not to make him seem like, old or anything. It's just that a black and white picture is appropriate for this, I believe. So we have here in our thought experiment, Mary. Mary is a color scientist, which means that she knows every physical fact that there is to know about color. So Mary knows all about, I don't know, everything you can think of. Color theory, she knows it. The physics of light and optics, she knows all of it. The neurophysiology of color vision, she knows it. She knows every physical fact that there is to know about color. But Mary spent her entire life in a black and white room. So she's never actually seen color before. The room has such a causal power that anyone inside the room can only see in black and white. Now here's the kicker. So imagine Mary's in this black and white room. She knows every physical fact about color, but she's never experienced color for herself. One day, Mary is let out of the room. She sees color for the first time. What will Mary's reaction be? Will Mary be surprised? Wow, I never knew that red would look like that. Or will she say, oh, I knew this is what all these colors would look like? What do we think? What do your intuitions tell you about Mary's response to seeing color for the first time? Remember, she knows every physical fact about color. So will she be surprised, or will she be like, "Oh, no, I knew red would look like that. No big deal." So Becky thinks be very surprised. Mohammed surprised. Funmi surprised. A lot of you are saying she'd be surprised. Okay. Anyone thinks she wouldn't be surprised? Yeah, Mirandy, that's good. Um, how indeed? Well, if she knows every physical fact about color, but surprised, then that must mean the physical description of the universe leaves something out, right? Namely the subjective, phenomenological aspect of color. But Milan thinks she wouldn't be surprised. Okay. Yeah, Taylor, that's a good point. Because remember there's propositional knowledge, there's knowing that, right? But there's also knowing how. Maybe Mary has complete propositional knowledge of color science, but she doesn't know how when it comes to color. She doesn't know what it's like. Yeah, so okay, so a lot of you are thinking that Mary will be surprised. So what is this thought experiment supposed to tell us? Well, it gets us to this knowledge argument against physicalism, right? The idea here is that physicalism says that the physical is all there is. So, okay, Mary's in this room, and she knows all the physical facts about color. So if the physical facts are all that there is, then Mary should not be surprised when she leaves the room. Even though she's never seen color, because she knows everything about optics and the physics of light and the neurophysiology of color, she would have known what red was going to look like. So if you think that Mary would not be surprised, you're probably a physicalist, and you think that physicalism, if we could describe every physical fact, that would be like, okay, we've got every fact there is. But if you think Mary will be surprised, you might not be a physicalist. You might be a dualist of some kind, because Mary has this um, complete knowledge of color and color vision and color science. But if she's surprised when she's let out of the room, well, that means there's something she did not know, which means there's more than just physical facts. And that would imply that physicalism is false. Yeah. Yeah, this is kind of like Daniel Dennett's Robo Mary. Um, right? If we really allow Mary to know everything, then we'd have to say that, well, she would be able to figure out what it would look like if she really had exhaustive knowledge of color science, right? Um, yeah. So there's a lot of varying opinion in the chat, but that's kind of what this is about. That's what thought experiments are for, by the way, right? Thought experiments are like imaginary scenarios that are supposed to help us clarify fundamental concepts. So if you're not certain whether you're a physicalist or not, running through this thought experiment can tell you. Well, Mary, if she existed in the world, would not look like a character on a black and white television, right? She'd look like you or I. She'd be in like a she would have normal colors, right? But remember, the room that she's in makes it such that she can only see in black and white. while she's in the room. Yeah, it is tricky to imagine, but so if you think Mary will be surprised, you probably think there's more to the universe than just physical facts. Um, yeah, I mean, it might not be impossible. Like, here's the thing: there's no right or wrong answer here. This is designed to tell you where you sit, dualism or physicalism. Um, if you think Mary will be surprised, then you probably think there's more kinds of facts than just physical facts. So physicalism is incomplete at best. But if you do not think Mary will be surprised, then, oh, well, all there are, it must be that all there are physical facts, right? That's how that works. Um, so getting back on track here, there are two types of dualism we could talk about. There's substance dualism. Substance dualism says that there are two types of substances. There's mental substance or mind, and there's physical substance, matter. You know, substance dualism is like what you find when you read Rene Descartes' Meditations. In fact, Descartes is kind of like the substance dualist, right? But there's also property dualism. Property dualism is actually a kind of substance monism, like physicalism, right? So there is only one kind of substance, and it's a physical substance, you know, so matter, energy, etc. But if you have particular arrangements of matter, non-physical properties like mental properties can emerge from those arrangements of matter. So, for example, brains, right? Brains are made of matter, but that matter is put together in a very special way where mental properties emerge from brains, right? So why don't we look at each of these in turn, and we'll start with substance dualism. So on substance dualism, mental objects are minds, and minds are non-physical. They have no physical properties. Of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, Rene Descartes is a very famous advocate of substance dualism, and he argues in Meditations on First Philosophy that there are these two substances. There is res extensa, that's Latin for extended substance, and what Descartes means there is matter. So matter is extended, meaning it takes up space. It has mass. It has shape, right? So on and so forth. That's matter. And then there's res cogitans. That means thinking substance. And that's the mind or the soul. And Descartes thought that we could come to know about minds via introspection, so looking inside of our own minds. So some of you said that we don't really perceive, earlier you said we don't really perceive the contents of our own minds, but we can, in a sense. We can introspect, right? But what makes our thoughts different? What makes my thoughts mine and not yours? Right? If res cogitans or mental items are non-physical and they don't take up space, well, what's the difference between my belief that Ottawa is the capital of Canada and your belief that Ottawa is the capital of Canada? Well, one difference, the most important difference, arguably, is that my belief occurs to me, right? It belongs to me, and yours belongs to you, right? Mental events occur to individual subjects. So my belief occurs to me, and that's what makes it mine. My perception of this coffee cup, let's go back to the screen, right? I have a perception of this coffee cup, but it's mine. It belongs to me. And yours is different. Yours occurs to you. So that's what sort of differentiates everybody's mental items from one another. What do we think of substance dualism so far? Well, there's still that subjectivity, right? Like I can tell you, oh, I've got this really great idea for my philosophy paper. I'm going to write it about dualism. Um, but once I tell that to you, then, you kind of have that idea. I've given it to you, but the idea that you have, it's yours, and I still have my idea in my mind, right? We still all have our own mental representations, right? All right, so property dualism says that there's a difference between the mental and the physical, but it's not a difference of substance, it's a difference of properties, right? Because remember, there is just physical stuff, matter and energy. But if the matter is put together in the right way, then it can have mental properties in addition to physical properties. One way we say this in philosophy is that mental properties supervene on physical properties, right? Now, substance dualists and property dualists each argue that the mental is not reducible to the physical, it's irreducible. So the mental is something more than the physical. It might be a different substance, it might be a special kind of property that only occurs if your physical substance is put together in the right way. But either way, we say that if we're dualists, the mind cannot be explained by appealing to physical processes and only physical processes. So, what are some arguments for dualism? That's what we ought to spend the rest of today's discussion on. So, maybe dualism, probably substance dualism, is required in order to explain freedom of the will and life after death. These are big questions that, well, there's a whole chapter on freedom of the will coming up. This book doesn't really look at life after death. That's really more of a theology or religious studies thing. But I think you can see where I'm going with this, right? If something is to survive the death of the physical body, like your soul, then it must be non-physical, right? I mean, most of the afterlives in the world's major religions would seem to require substance dualism. I mean, what do we think? Let's get some discussion going in the chat. Yeah, yeah. If I mean, not everyone's going to believe in life after death, but say you do believe in life after death, you're probably a dualist, right? So, if you think that you, the you that is you, right, your soul is going to survive the death of the body, then it must be because, and this goes all the way back to Plato, right? Um, the body is like material, corporeal, but the soul is immortal and divine, right? That's what Plato argues via Socrates in his dialogue Phaedo. So, um, if you believe in life after death and you want to explain how it's possible, you're probably going to do it by appealing to substance dualism. Now, this is not to say that all physicalists would say that the soul cannot survive the death of the body, right? Maybe if we could program minds somehow into computers, we could upload our minds to computers so that the mind survives the death of the physical body, right? So it some physicalists would say that sure, the mind can maybe survive the death of the body, um, but chances are, most people aren't thinking of it that way. They're probably thinking of the mind as a soul. Um, and for it to survive the death of the body, it must be made of something different from the body, some kind of immaterial substance, perhaps. So, not sure if you're a physicalist or property dualist. No problem. Well, remember, property dualists are physicalists of a certain kind, right? Um, let's see, the illusion of free will. Um, well, actually, that's what Daniel Wegner used to argue, psychologist from Harvard University. He called free will the mind's best trick. Um, could you have life after death without being? Yeah, I mean, if you're a physicalist, maybe we can upload ourselves to computers, as I was saying. That would be kind of like a maybe, although I wouldn't call it life. That sounds terrible to me, but um, what about free will? Well, physicalism implies that the universe is determined, right? It's causally closed. Um, things happen because they are caused by other things. Physical events happen because they're caused by other physical events. But we don't seem to be determined in that same way, right? So maybe a physicalist would say, well, we're determined, we don't really have free will. A non-physical mind, well, a dualist would say, well, it seems like we do, though. And maybe that's because we have this non-physical mind that explains how we can act the way we want. Um, but a physicalist could say, well, hang on there might be mental laws just like there are physical laws. So it's not necessarily the case that, dualism, it's not necessarily implied by dualism um, that determinism is false, but it's possible. Although you could be a dualist and still be a determinist, right? It's just we're dealing with mental laws rather than physical laws. So those are a couple of reasons why um, those are a couple of reasons why you might choose to adopt dualism. Um, you may believe in life after death, and um, in order to explain how that's possible, you can make an appeal to substance dualism. Um, and if you want to explain freedom of the will, um, maybe you need substance dualism for that. Although neither of these, as we've just seen, necessarily imply dualism, right? Two arguments that are a lot more important for dualists are the introspection argument and the conceivability argument. Um, the introspection argument is interesting. It tells us, or rather, it says that our senses, just like they tell us something about the world out here, introspection can tell us about our mental world. And the physical descriptions that we use for objects in the world, those don't really work for describing the mental world. So you can kind of make sense of this by doing another thought experiment. This is called Leibniz's mill. Um, so Leibniz has us imagine that we could shrink ourselves and become really, really small so that we could walk around inside the brain, almost as if you were walking inside of a giant mill. If you could, back in Leibniz's day, there were lots of different kinds of mills. Let's say we have a windmill. We can go inside a windmill, right? And you can see all of the mechanics of the mill. So the wind blows the blades, which turn this thing, which turns this other thing, which turns, um, I don't know, perhaps a big giant stone, and that's what we mill our flour with or something, right? Imagine that you could shrink down and look at the mechanics of the brain in the same way. You're walking around in the brain, and you see physical processes unfolding, right? There are neurons firing. Excuse me. You can see the electrical and chemical processes at play in the brain. Uh, so you can see um, you can observe changes in electrical potential along the axons, which cause neurons to fire and release neurotransmitters into the synapses. And you can see how all this activity propagates through the neural networks and so forth. But you wouldn't see mental objects themselves. You wouldn't see anything like thoughts or memories or perceptions, right? Leibniz would say these just don't seem like physical things. It's as if you just entered into a giant mill. All you see is mechanical forces, things kind of pushing and pulling against one another, but you don't actually see the mental stuff. So the mental must not be physical. That's Leibniz's mill. What do we think? Well, I wouldn't use the word representation. I would say realization. So yeah, and I agree. I mean, you can absolutely argue that what we're seeing is the physical realization of the thoughts, because there's still a subjective element to all of this, right? Yeah. So you can absolutely reject Leibniz's line of thinking here, right? Maybe what the physical things that we are observing are just what realize or instantiate the mental states, in the same way that the logic gates on a circuit board are what represent an image, right? Well, I would say that the picture is sort of abstract, but it doesn't make it less real, right? Right, but you can't see the thoughts, right? That's the introspection argument, right? Like I can look inside and see my own thoughts. But if I shrank down and walked around your brain, all I would see is neurons firing. That's the idea behind this thought experiment. And like one of you said, who was it? Christian. Yeah, it's meant to highlight a similar sort of thing as Mary's room. It's meant to kind of highlight the idea that there's more to the mental than merely the physical. Um, so that's the point of this. If we look inside with introspection, it's supposed to reveal that the mind is non-physical, similar to Leibniz's mill. But how could a physicalist respond to this? They could say that, well, think about perception. It doesn't really reveal the world the way it is on a really fine-grained level, right? If I look at this cup, I see a cup. I have visual senses, but they don't reveal to me the world of, atoms that make the cup, right? I can't see all those protons and neutrons and electrons, those very small subatomic particles, but they're there. And maybe introspection is also like this, right? So maybe, as a physicalist would say, all of my mental items, my memories, my thoughts, beliefs, and desires, and so forth, are really just neurons firing. But my visual, or rather my introspective powers don't allow me to see this in the same way that my visual powers don't allow me to see, atoms or molecules. right? I just can't see that far down. Maybe I can't introspect that far down either, right? Now, this counter argument doesn't outright disprove dualism, but it does give us pause when it comes to the introspection argument, right? What about the conceivability argument? This one's a bit trickier. This is a metaphysical argument for dualism. Physicalists are making a metaphysical claim, right? They say that everything that exists is physical. So the mind must be physical as well. The mind is necessarily physical. How could a dualist respond to this? Well, they have to show that it's logically possible for the mind to be non-physical, because that would show that the mind is not necessarily physical. So, just a quick note, logical possibility is different from physical possibility. The example Crumley uses is this. It is physically impossible to travel faster than the speed of light, but it's actually not logically impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. I can conceive of going faster than light, right? Maybe via some kind, excuse me, some kind of Star Wars like hyperdrive or warp drive from Star Trek or something like that, right? I can conceive of going faster than light, but physically I cannot go faster than light. So remember that logical necessity means that it has to be this way. So it's if the physicalist claim is that the mind has to be physical, it's necessarily physical. But if it's logically possible that the mind is not physical, then it's not necessary that it's physical either. And to show that something is logically possible, what we have to do is show that it is conceivable. This is how conceivability arguments work. So one version of the conceivability argument comes from Descartes. This is, of course, Crumley's rendering of it. If you look in Descartes' writings, you won't find it laid out exactly like this, but this is kind of how it goes. It goes, for the first premise, I can conceive of a mind existing separately from a body. So premise 2, if I can conceive something, then it's conceivable. To premise 3, if it's conceivable, then it's possible. Premise 4, so that means it's possible for a mind to exist separately from any body. If it's possible for minds to exist separately, logically possible, that is, then then physicalism is false. If physicalism is false, then dualism is true. So our conclusion is that dualism is true. This is the core of Descartes' argument, right? What this argument does is try to show that it's logically possible for some non-physical thing to exist. In this case, a mind. That is enough to show that physicalism is false. And the only option, the only alternative for Descartes is substance dualism. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to buy conceivability arguments, right? An idealist wouldn't buy this conceivability argument. An idealist is another kind of substance monist who says only minds exist, but they wouldn't want to limit themselves to just two options, physicalism and dualism. We can also question this move from conceivability to possibility, right? Conceivability doesn't make things logically possible, right? Crumley writes about the student he had who claimed to be able to conceive of a square circle, right? Okay, that's cool. Square circles are logically impossible. So perhaps we can conceive of things that are, conceivable, of course, but not logically possible. I could conceive of a four-sided rectangle, or no, that's too easy. A four-sided triangle, right? Or a square circle. or a round square. These are conceivable. I've just conceived of them. But they're not logically possible. Heck, I can conceive of plenty of things which might be logically impossible that are also physically impossible, just like traveling faster than light. I can conceive of that, but that's not physically possible. I can conceive of a winged horse, but those don't exist, right? So the move from conceivability to possibility is one that some people support. Yeah, weird. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's that this knowledge is not that this argument is not necessarily logical. But yeah, I think that I don't buy his arguments, right? What else does he have to say? We can also flip the conceivability argument stuff around, right? Well, I mean, do you have to picture it? Can I just say, what if there's a circle that's square, right? That's conceiving of it in a way. Doesn't mean I have to, well, to conceive, to come up with the idea, to conceive of the idea, to just have the idea. So I can have an idea of a four-sided triangle, like, oh, yeah, a four-sided triangle. Wouldn't that be something? I've just conceived of a four-sided triangle, right? But we can actually flip conceivability arguments around to show that they're not compelling. And Crumley does this with the idea that lightning is static electricity discharge. Yeah, that's fair. But let's just say for argument's sake that it's possible to do that. Then that just illustrates that you can conceive of something that is logically impossible. Here, let's make it simpler. Can you conceive of an event without a cause? That way we're not dealing with any weird visual spatial properties, right? Um, yeah, so but is that really how it works? I don't know. Look, let's not get stuck on this. I want to get onto this I mean, I suppose maybe Mary the color scientist could. Um but the event without a cause thing. I mean, like most, like all events that we observe in the physical world have causes. Um, you can conceive of an event without a cause, perhaps the creation of the universe. Um, whether that's the way it works is unclear, right? Perhaps the universe is uncaused, right? Um, uh, Perhaps it was caused from a previous universe, sort of Big Bang and Big Crunch cycle. Maybe God did it, and God is the cause, right? My point is that conceiving of an event without a cause is easy to do, but it's way outside of our everyday experience, right? And yeah, perhaps Mary could conceive of a new color. I don't know. This though, this argument. If we flip conceivability arguments around, right? A long time ago, even the ancient Greeks knew something about static electricity, right? In fact, their word for amber, the petrified tree resin, if you rub it with a cloth, you can make static electric sparks. Our word for electricity comes from the ancient Greek word for amber, electra. So the Greeks knew about it, and they knew about lightning. But it wasn't conceivable to the Greeks that lightning was just very powerful static electricity discharge. It is, right? Lightning is just a, a really big, powerful version of shuffling your feet across the carpet and touching the doorknob and getting a shock. Lightning is just a much, much bigger, more powerful version of that. But that was not conceivable to say the ancient Greeks. So let's look at that argument. Lightning, which is not static electricity discharge, is conceivable because the ancient Greeks, for example, didn't understand lightning as static electricity discharge. If it's conceivable, then it's possible. So it's possible for lightning to exist separately from static electricity discharge. If it's possible for there to be lightning without static electricity discharge, then the lightning equals static electricity discharge theory is false. But of course, nobody would argue that the theory that lightning is electrical discharge in the atmosphere is false on the basis of a conceivability argument, right? So this is in philosophy what we call a reductio ad absurdum. We're taking this idea of the conceivability argument and reducing it to absurdity to show that it's false. And that's why our conclusion is that conceivability arguments are not compelling, because we know that lightning is very powerful static electricity discharge. Just because the ancient Greeks didn't conceive of lightning as static electricity discharge, that does not mean that it's possible, right? Um, it's kind of it's wacky, right? I can conceive of lightning as not static electricity discharge. I can conceive of it as, being thrown from Mount Olympus by Zeus. So it's possible that lightning is not static electricity, but no scientist would claim that, right? So maybe conceivability arguments are not very compelling. And also, what about mental causation, right? How can thoughts cause things? Um, maybe we need dualism to explain this. Maybe using dualism to explain this raises more problems than it solves. So, for example, when I got up this morning, I formed I had a desire for a cup of coffee. And on the basis of that desire, a mental item, I formed the intention to go into the kitchen and make some coffee. That's what I did. I put the kettle on, put some coffee in the French press, poured that boiling water on top, let it sit for 5 minutes, get a nice cup of coffee going. So my desires, my intentions, my beliefs, there are beliefs at play here too, like, oh, I keep my coffee grinds in the fridge to keep it fresh. The cream's in the fridge too. The French press is on the countertop. The kitchen is downstairs, right? All these beliefs and desires and intentions, these mental items interact with one another in a causal way. And they cause me to get myself into the kitchen and make some coffee. But how does that work, right? Mental items, if they're non-physical, how can they affect the body? And how can processes in the body, physical processes in the body, affect the mental? This is the problem of causal interaction. Or if you like, it's the mind-body interaction problem. And this problem was raised by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in a letter to Descartes. And she wrote him after reading his meditations. This is Princess Elizabeth here. This is her, in case you're wondering, this is her spear. Princess Elizabeth was apparently quite the hunter. She liked to hunt with a spear. So watch out, Descartes. Princess Elizabeth is after you. So what's the problem here? Well, again, your thoughts, your mental states, those are supposed to be non-physical. How does something non-physical affect the body? And how can physical processes affect the mental? Descartes thought that it was the pineal gland, which is a gland in the brain. You see, the brain is largely kind of like mirror image of itself, right? There's a right and a left side to the brain, and they mirror one another. In the brain, you have two of most everything. One of the exceptions is the pineal gland, which is a gland that today we understand is part of the endocrine system. So it's important for releasing certain hormones, which are chemical messengers that tell the body to do different things. But Descartes thought that the pineal gland was actually the spot where the soul interacted with the body. In giving this explanation, Descartes sort of gave a location for mind-body interaction, but he didn't really explain how it was supposed to have worked, how the soul affected the nerves of the body, the nerves and muscles of the body, or how the sensory systems affected the soul. So Princess Elizabeth writes in her letter, "Excuse my stupidity in being able to comprehend from what you had previously said concerning weight, the idea by which we should judge how the soul, non-extended and immaterial, can move the body, nor why this power ought to persuade us that the body can be pushed by something immaterial, any more than the demonstration of a contrary truth, as you promise in your physics, confirms in us the opinion of its impossibility." Right? Descartes, you're writing all about physics and how material objects affect one another. How on earth could an immaterial object affect a physical object? It doesn't make sense. Moreover, and this, by the way, is not in Crumley. This is from a different philosophy textbook that I have. How can the mind of a human being only a thinking substance, um, or how the mind of a human being can determine the bodily spirits in producing bodily actions. The bodily spirits or animal spirits are like this sort of fluid that Descartes thinks is what causes us to move, kind of like almost like a hydraulic system, like as if we've got a robot body that runs on hydraulics, and the hydraulic fluid are these animal spirits, right? Yeah. Oh, she's absolutely right. Um, For it appears that all determination of movement is produced by the pushing of the thing being moved, by the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else by the qualification and figure of the surface of the latter. Contact is required for the first two conditions, and extension for the third. But you entirely exclude the latter from the notion you have of the soul, and the former seems incompatible with an immaterial thing. So yeah, that's the mind-body interaction problem. How on earth does a immaterial substance affect a material substance and vice versa? Descartes does not explain it. What do you think? I mean, do we agree with Princess Elizabeth, or are we more on the side of Rene Descartes? Let's have a bit of chit chat before we wrap it up. So few of you agree with her. I agree with her, personally speaking. I mean, this doesn't show that Descartes is wrong. It does, again, it does not necessarily disprove substance dualism. Um, but it does highlight the fact that at least Descartes and his dualism has some explaining to do, which it hasn't done, right? What do you mean, Christian? He's too hasty to find a reason? What do you mean exactly? I guess, I mean, after all, Descartes, One of the things that Crumley oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. So he's looking, he could be right, but maybe he's misidentified the misidentified the important thing here. It's not the pineal gland, right? After this part, right as Crumley is ending this bit of the chapter, um, he mentioned something interesting. Descartes, most of us, when we understand causation, cause and effect, we we kind of think that we get the our ideas of cause and effect from the world, right? We observe all kinds of causal chains and causal processes in the physical world, and that's where our understanding of cause and effect comes from. Like David Hume, right? David Hume says we get this idea that effects necessarily follow from causes because we always observe these constant conjunctions of cause and effect out there in the world. Of course, Hume would say that we're not justified in believing that effects necessarily follow causes, right? Um, but we get this sort of habit. We're naturally inclined, right? Crumley says, well, what if Descartes' ideas of causality do not come from observing the world, but actually from introspection? Maybe Descartes is getting his idea of causation from, how mental events cause physical events. Like I desire to take a sip of coffee, which causes me to reach out and actually pick up the cup and take a sip of coffee. So maybe that explains the sort of angle that Descartes is coming from here. And Descartes would respond to Princess Elizabeth by saying, "Hey, well, look, we might just have to call it a brute fact that the mental can affect the physical, and that the physical can also affect the mental. So it's just a brute fact, a basic fact that my intentions, my beliefs and desires can all interact and cause me to make certain physical behaviors, like picking up coffee cups and drinking from them. We just have to take it as a brute fact that, light entering my eyes and causing all these physical things to happen in my optic nerves and in my brain will cause in my soul, a phenomenal visual experience. That's what he would say. Yeah, trust me, bro. Yeah. Well, that's a good example. Yeah, I mean, people who have depression feel, like you say, tired and drained. So, how does that work? Yeah, there are physical aspects to it, but the mystery still kind of remains. Like cortisol, serotonin, these are not inherently like say you have more cortisol and less serotonin. Well, serotonin doesn't feel good on its own, right? uh if anything, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because we haven't talked about functionalism yet, but serotonin, you people sometimes think of it as like a happiness molecule. It's not like it's happiness itself. It's the functional role that it plays in the brain and the nervous system that causes us to, if we have enough serotonin to feel happy, if we don't have enough to feel depressed, for example, right? Well, not exactly. Emotions are not just feelings. There's more to emotions than neurotransmitters. Although neurotransmitters are certainly important. Um, yeah, yeah, that's called emotional contagion. So, um, what I'm trying to say is, Actually, I've kind of forgotten what I was trying to say. Oh, right. Descartes. Yeah, he his understanding of cause and effect may be sort of an introspective one, not not an understanding of cause effect gauged by looking at physical processes in the world. That said, the problem remains, right? How is all of this supposed to work? Um, I don't know. What do we think? I'll let you know, like, personal opinion alert. I am more on the side of the physicalists. But I still think that we've got some explaining to do, right? Um, yeah, I can talk about, neurotransmitters doing their thing, neural firing patterns, and so forth, so on and so forth. Um, Wavelengths of light hitting my retina and affecting my nerves in a certain way. But why is my experience the way it is and not some other way? Right? If I look at a red apple, there's light of a certain wavelength reflecting off the apple and hitting my retina and going through the optic nerves and so on and so forth. So I have this experience of this red apple. But why does the apple look the way it does and not some other way, right? Why does red look like red and not blue? Um these are the tricky questions that I think we're still left with. And we will explore some of them next time when we go on to talk about um, physicalism. Yeah, I mean, maybe physicalism is incomplete as well, like you say, Ryan. We haven't answered these tricky questions, the ones related to qualia and phenomenology. What David Chalmers would call the hard problem of consciousness. How can objective physical processes give rise to subjective conscious experiences? That's the hard problem of consciousness. Um, and Chalmers is kind of like a property dualist. So he would say, well, there's something special about minds. They have non-physical properties. So he's not a substance dualist, he's a property dualist. So that's one way to sort of tackle this. But yeah, physicalism is arguably incomplete, right? We do not know all of the physical facts. That's correct. I do not believe in life after death, nor the paranormal, personally speaking. I'm what you call a naturalist. Naturalism, physicalism, quite closely related, right? Remember when we were talking about natural epistemology, right? Very influenced by naturalism. So I'm a naturalist myself. I just think that there are natural things. I don't think that there are supernatural things. Now, that means that if there is life after death, um, I think it's going to be something like uploading your mind to a computer, not being a ghost. But I don't think that uploading myself to a computer is very appealing. I think that would be weird, right? Um, well, I don't know. I mean, physicalism is a metaphysical theory. It's not a scientific theory, right? Physicalism just says that what exists is the physical. And then it's scientists' job to go and discover what kinds of physical things there are and what they're like, right? That's the job of the scientist. And but that's not to say that that can't inform philosophy. I mean, if scientists ever discovered a non-physical substance, that would inform our metaphysics. But I'm not sure how they would do that because science only looks at what is natural. Science doesn't deal with the supernatural, right? So if there was a non-physical substance, how would our physical scientific instruments even detect it, right? Yeah, Yeah, if scientists found a mechanism by which the brain gave rise to subjective experience, then that would be strong evidence for physicalism. I mean, we already kind of have evidence like this, right? We know that damage to certain brain areas causes very specific differences in like perception and thinking and in behavior, right? Like if I if I damage my visual cortex, my occipital cortex back here, the visual areas, that'll affect my vision, right? If I have a stroke in the left temporal area, that's probably going to affect language, right? Um, so we kind of already have this picture. I mean, and most neuroscientists are physicalists, right? But some of them, as we'll see next time, are reductive physicalists. They reduce the mental to the physical. Some are not, right? So we're going to look at a bunch of different kinds of physicalism. We've already looked at um, property dualism. That's a type of physicalism. But we also have various kinds of identity theory, which say that mental states are identical with either types of brain states or individual token brain states. We have functionalism, which says that um, what matters is really um, what a mind does, not what it's made of. So a functionalist would say it might even be a mistake to focus on the brain. Sure, my mind seems to be contingent upon or supervene upon my brain, but there are lots of ways to realize a mind. Maybe we could realize a mind with computer chips in a robot, for example. And then there's eliminativism, which says that we should actually dispense with our mentalistic terms. Beliefs, desires, these are silly folk notions like elan vital or phlogiston or the luminiferous ether. We don't need those concepts anymore. And one day we won't need concepts like beliefs and desires. So that's what we'll look at next time. So thanks everyone. I've gone a little bit over today, but I'll see you all on Wednesday, where we'll continue discussing physicalism. All right. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Oh no, my laptop is dying. All right. Take care, everyone.